The chamber was carved from metal that seemed to drink in the light, a throne hall designed not for comfort, but for intimidation. Banners of a dozen conquered species hung limp along the walls, and the air smelled faintly of scorched ozone, as though violence lingered in every corner. Soldiers lined the edges of the room, their armor polished to an unnatural gleam, yet not one of them dared raise their gaze above the black stone steps. At the top sat the figure who commanded both their fear and their worship, the alien woman known throughout the Orion Arm as the harbinger of silence. Her presence was less like a living creature, and more like a storm condensed into flesh. Her eyes, facete and luminous, glowed with a shifting violet fire, and a line of jagged scars ran down one side of her angular face like lightning frozen in skin. Even her breathing seemed dangerous, heavy with an unspoken threat. It was said she had ended wars by walking unarmed into battle, that she had once silenced a council of rival warlords simply by letting them look upon her. She embodied fear, and fear served her as faithfully as any blade. The guards dragged in a human, his wrists bound but his posture oddly unbroken. Compared to the vastness of the chamber, he looked fragile, shorter than most of the towering soldiers, his skin pale from months aboard cold ships, his uniform marked with dust and travel stains. Yet his eyes carried no tremor of panic. He looked around with a kind of measured curiosity, as though trying to memorize every detail rather than escape them. A murmur spread through the ranks of alien warriors. Even prisoners from hardened war species often shook when placed before her. This one did not. His lack of terror unsettled them more than screaming would have. The woman leaned forward on her throne, her voice rolling out like thunder contained in words. "Do you understand where you stand, human?" Her language was not his, but the translators embedded in the walls carried the weight of her tone perfectly. "I think so," he said evenly. "On the floor of a hall where everyone wishes I were already dead." The soldiers shifted uneasily, not at the words themselves but at the calmness with which they were spoken. Defiance had been shown before, but always trembling, always desperate. This man spoke as if he had nothing to lose. Her lips curved, not quite a smile, but close enough to be mistaken for one. "They whisper my name across star systems. They tell their children to obey, or I will come for them. Even my own kind lower their eyes in my presence. Do you know why, human?" He tilted his head, studying her as though she were a puzzle rather than a monster. "Because they believe you want them to fear you." The chamber grew colder, or perhaps it only felt that way. The alien guards pressed back against the walls, knowing the weight of silence when it preceded a death. No one contradicted her without paying in blood. She rose slowly from the throne, every movement deliberate, the faint shimmer of energy coiling around her limbs like smoke. Her voice was lower now, almost intimate, though it carried to every corner. "Everyone is afraid of me. But why aren't you?" The human met her eyes. His breath was steady, his hands still bound, yet his stance did not falter. "Because fear is a choice, and I don't see the point in giving it to you." Gasps rippled through the chamber. One of the guards slammed a staff against the floor, expecting her command to cut him down where he stood. But she did not raise her hand. She only looked at him, truly looked, as though something in his answer had cracked the surface of her carefully maintained facade. For years she had ruled through terror, shaping her identity into the blade others thought her to be. She had grown accustomed to the trembling, the groveling, the instinctive recall. Yet this single human, unremarkable by strength, unimpressive by heritage, stood as though she were nothing more than another obstacle to navigate. It was not arrogance, not exactly. It was something else. Something she had not encountered in longer than she could remember. She circled him slowly, her footsteps echoing in the vast hall. "Do you think me weak then? Do you mistake restraint for mercy?" "No," he said, following her with his eyes. "I think you're powerful. But I also think you're more than what people say. Fear blinds them from seeing that." The scarred corner of her mouth twitched, a fraction of expression almost buried beneath years of discipline. She stopped in front of him, close enough that the glow of her eyes cast faint shadows across his face. "Your kind burns quickly," she murmured. "Short lives, fragile bodies, and yet you dare stand without trembling." Her voice hardened. "Do you believe that will save you?" "I don't believe anything saves anyone forever," he replied. "But it seems to me you've been waiting a long time for someone who doesn't bow." The hall was silent enough to hear the crackle of the energy that danced along her fingertips. 100 soldiers held their breath, waiting for the inevitable order. Instead, the woman lifted her hand and the bindings on his wrists dissolved into dust. He flexed his arms, surprised but careful not to show too much relief. The harbinger of silence turned away from him, her cloak sweeping the floor as she returned to her throne. For a moment she seemed to hesitate, as though unsure whether to dismiss him or to command him to remain. At last she spoke, her words like stone breaking against stone. "Leave us," she ordered the guards. The soldiers looked at one another in confusion, then obeyed. The chamber emptied until only the alien woman and the human remained, the heavy door sealing behind the last armored figure. The silence that followed was different now, no longer heavy with expectation, but charged with an unspoken question neither yet knew how to answer. She studied him once more, eyes unreadable, and then leaned back in her throne. "You intrigue me, human," she said at last. "And that may be more dangerous than fear." He did not reply, but the faintest flicker of a smile touched his lips. The chamber seemed to exhale around them, as though the entire empire had just shifted by a fraction of a degree, set on a new course because one man refused to tremble. The chamber was quieter without the ranks of armored soldiers, yet the silence between the human and the alien woman felt heavier than their presence had ever been. She lounged on her throne with deliberate stillness, as though testing how long he could endure her scrutiny. He stood unbound, though not free, his arms loose at his sides, eyes calm but alert. It was not defiance she read in him, not exactly. He radiated something subtler, an unwillingness to be shaped by her presence. That, more than arrogance or rebellion, unsettled her. "You speak of choice," she said at last, her voice curling through the air like smoke. "But choice is a luxury. Entire worlds collapse under the weight of mine. Do you think it's so simple to stand against me without fear?" He drew a slow breath, choosing his words with care. "I think fear has its place. It keeps people alive when danger is close. But living in it, drowning in it, turns survival into a cage. Maybe that's why I don't give it to you. I'd rather see the person than the cage they've built around her." Her gaze sharpened. "Person," she echoed, tasting the word as though it were foreign. "I am not one of your kind. My blood is older than your species' fire. Empires bend to me because they know my hand can unmake them. And still you speak as if I were," she cut herself off, unwilling to complete the thought. "As if you were more than a weapon," he offered gently. The scars along her cheek seemed to deepen as her jaw tightened. Memories pressed against her silence, her training halls drenched in screams, her coronation upon the ashes of rivals, her commanders teaching her that mercy was weakness, that fear was the only leash that truly held. She had accepted it, because to refuse would have meant annihilation. But this human's words pierced through those long-forged certainties like light through fractured glass. "You assume much," she said, but the edge of her voice carried something close to weariness. "Tell me, then, what of your kind? Does humanity not rule with fear when pressed against the void? Do you not conquer as we conquer?" He considered her carefully, his expression tightening as though weighing how much truth to offer. "We fight. We survive. Sometimes we're cruel. But the best of us, we build. We'll look at the void and try to leave something behind in it. Families. Art. Hope. That's what keeps us from breaking." Her head tilted, eyes narrowing in faint puzzlement. Hope. The word tasted strange to her. Hope had never filled her stomach when it was empty, never shielded her from assassins in the night. Yet here he stood, fragile by every measure, speaking of it as though it was steel. She rose from her throne, her movements slow and deliberate. A ripple of violet light flickered across her skin, a reminder of the energy that had toppled war fleets. With a flick of her hand, the air shimmered, and an illusion took shape between them. Visions of her past campaigns, entire planets shrouded in flame, the corpses of enemies littering the ground. The weight of it pressed against him, a psychic wave meant to crush his will. He staggered for a heartbeat under the onslaught, but did not collapse. His jaw set, his breath came harsher, and he forced himself to meet her gaze even as the images clawed at his mind. "You're strong," he said through clenched teeth. "But strength isn't the same as fear. You can burn every world in this galaxy, and still someone will stand up and refuse to bow." The illusions shattered like glass, leaving the hall dim and bare once more. For the first time in many years, the harbinger of silence felt the faintest flicker of surprise that bordered on respect. Most beings crumbled under her smallest projection of power. He had endured it, wounded but unbroken. "You caught death with every word," she said softly, though there was no anger in it now. "Yet I find myself unwilling to silence you." He exhaled, straightening his stance. "Maybe that's because you don't want silence." "Not really. You've had it too long already." Her hand clenched against the armrest of her throne. The human could not know how close his words struck to the hollow at the core of her existence. Fear had made her untouchable, but it had also left her alone, surrounded by trembling allies and obedient enemies. Never a friend, never an equal. She walked toward him again, slower this time, her aura dimmed to a low shimmer. She studied his face with an intensity that would have made any other prisoner collapse under the weight of her attention. But he did not flinch. He only looked back, steady and curious, as though waiting for her to reveal something even she had forgotten. "You stand here unbroken," she murmured, stopping within arm's reach. "Not because you are stronger than me. Not because you are blind to death. But because you choose not to yield." He nodded once. "That's what makes us human. We break, but we don't stay broken." For a long while, she said nothing. The chamber seemed to breathe with her, shadows shifting across the banners of conquered species. Then, with deliberate slowness, she turned away from him. "You will remain here," she said, her tone calm but laced with something uncertain. "Not as a prisoner. Not yet as an ally. But I will have answers from you. Humanity intrigues me, and you are unlike any I have known." He inclined his head, accepting without submission. "Then I'll answer. But only if you're willing to listen." A faint sound left her, halfway between a scoff and a laugh, so rare it startled even her. She returned to her throne, lowering herself with regal control, yet the storm in her eyes was quieter than before. The doors remained sealed, and the empire outside continued to whisper her name in terror. Yet within the hall, something had shifted, something fragile, something dangerous. She had not killed him. She had not silenced him. And in the back of her mind, for the first time in years, a question formed that was not about conquest or obedience but about possibility. She rested her chin on her hand, studying him as though he were both puzzle and mirror. "Be careful, human. Curiosity is not mercy. It is far more dangerous." He gave the faintest smile, one that hinted at both challenge and promise. So is ignoring it. Her eyes lingered on him, and the silence between them no longer felt empty but charged, alive, as though the empire itself trembled on the edge of change. The days that followed unfolded in strange rhythms. The human was granted quarters within the fortress-like station that served as a seat of power, not gilded chambers of honor, but Spartan rooms that echoed the bare essentials of survival. He accepted them, without complaint, as though the lack of luxury suited him better than opulence ever could. Guards watched his every step, but they no longer touched their weapons at the sight of him. They had learned that their commander's interest in him was dangerous in its own right, and none wished to test where her curiosity ended and her wrath began. She summoned him often, not with chains but with requests. At first, their exchanges seemed little more than interrogations cloaked in conversation. She pressed him for details of humanity's wars, its survival across hostile worlds, its strange resilience in the face of extinction events. He answered with stories, some grim, some threaded with humor, as though laughter itself were a weapon his kind carried into the void. When he spoke of fragile ships braving endless dark or families rebuilding homes on the bones of ruined cities, her expression remained impassive, yet her eyes lingered on him longer than she intended. It was during one such exchange that she asked, "Do you not fear your species will crumble under the weight of larger empires? Your worlds are soft, your defenses thin." He shrugged lightly. "Maybe. But fear of falling hasn't kept us from climbing. Sometimes we win because the other side can't imagine we'd try something foolish enough to work." The words stayed with her. She had built her reign on predictability, on the certainty that fear guided every decision of her subjects and enemies alike. This human suggested a different currency, unpredictability born not from chaos but from conviction. It stirred something she had nearly forgotten, the sensation of being challenged without malice. Their time together did not go unnoticed. Whispers slithered through the ranks of her officers, who had grown used to a ruler untouchable and unyielding. Now they watched their commander linger in conversation with a fragile alien whose mere presence seemed to soften the edges of her voice. To them, it was not curiosity but weakness, and weakness invited ambition. The first signs of dissent arrived quietly, like fractures beneath stone. Reports delayed. Orders obeyed with just enough hesitation to sting. She dismissed them at first, unwilling to grant her rivals the satisfaction of visible concern. Yet the human noticed. He had been among soldiers before, and he recognized the subtle shifts of loyalty. One evening, as they stood overlooking the vast hangar where warships gleamed under pale light, he spoke with deliberate calm. "They are watching you, testing you, waiting for a moment when your attention slips." She did not look at him. "They have always watched me. Fear is their leash." "Leashes break," he said softly, "and fear cuts both ways. The more they feel it, the more they dream of living without it." Her jaw tightened, but she said nothing. The test came sooner than either expected. A summons to a council of generals, a demand disguised as duty. She entered the chamber with a human trailing at her side, an unusual breach of protocol that made the gathered officers exchange thinly veiled glances. They stood in a circle of polished steel, their armor marked not with loyalty but with ambition. One of the senior commanders stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of practiced confidence. "You have grown distracted. This human contaminates your judgment. Fear of you wanes while curiosity spreads, and curiosity breeds rebellion. For the stability of the empire, we demand you release him to us for questioning." The air thickened as though the walls themselves leaned in to hear her reply. She did not rise to her full height, did not flare the energy that could incinerate them where they stood. Instead, she tilted her head, violet fire simmering in her gaze. "You dare dictate terms to me." The commander's hand twitched toward his weapon. Around the circle, others shifted subtly, a tide of treachery waiting for its spark. It came not from her, but from them. A blade hissed free, and in an instant the chamber erupted into chaos. Officers lunged, not only at her, but at the human, eager to sever what they saw as the root of her weakness. The human reacted faster than any of them anticipated. He seized a fallen staff, its weight ungainly in his hands, but he wielded it with the improvisational fury of someone who had survived worse odds. He blocked, ducked, and struck with a raw practicality that left more than one opponent stumbling back in shock. She moved with the grace of inevitability, energy bursting from her limbs like chained lightning. Yet in the storm of combat, she noticed how he placed himself between her and an incoming strike, reckless but sincere, as though his fragile body could shield her from betrayal. It was unnecessary, even foolish, but the gesture struck deeper than any blade could. When the last traitor fell, the chamber reeked of scorched metal and blood. She stood amidst the carnage, her breath steady, her hands glowing faintly with spent power. Across from her, the human leaned on the staff, bruised and blooded but unbowed. His eyes met hers, not seeking approval, only confirming survival. For a long moment, she said nothing. The silence was filled only with the drip of blood on steel. Then she crossed the distance between them and laid a hand lightly on his shoulder. The gesture was subtle, almost imperceptible, but for her it was more vulnerable than any word. "You risked yourself for me," she murmured, her tone unreadable. He winced faintly but managed a crooked smile. "Someone had to. Besides, I thought you liked curiosity." The corner of her mouth twitched, not quite a smile but no longer stone. She looked at him, truly looked, and for the first time in her reign, she wondered if fear had not been her greatest strength but her greatest prison. The surviving loyal officers knelt, shaken not by fear alone, but by the sight of their invincible commander standing close to a human she had chosen not to destroy. The shape of her rule was changing, and they knew it. She knew it too, though whether it would save or ruin her remained uncertain. She turned away from the corpses and the whispers of rebellion, her voice steady as she commanded, "Seal the station. Any who question my authority will share the fate of these traitors." As the officers scrambled to obey, she glanced back at the human. His presence was no longer an anomaly she could dismiss. He was a catalyst, a mirror, perhaps even a future she could not yet name. And in the shadow of betrayal, she felt something unexpected. Trust. Fragile, dangerous, but alive. The aftermath of the attempted coup spread like cracks through glass. Whispers slithered across the station's corridors, and beyond them to the distant colonies that answered to her name. For years, her authority had been absolute, rooted in the certainty that she could not be challenged. Now that certainty trembled, not because she had faltered in battle, but because she had permitted something unthinkable, a human standing at her side, alive, unbroken, and seen. She felt the tension each time she entered hall, each time loyal officers bent their heads but kept their thoughts veiled. The human noticed it too. He said little of it, but his eyes caught the wary glances, the silence that stretched a fraction too long. He had lived among soldiers before. He recognized when loyalty had shifted from conviction to calculation. One night, overlooking the endless scatter of stars through the fortress viewport, she broke the silence between them. "They think I've grown weak." He turned, the pale light catching the lines of fatigue on his face. "Do you believe them?" Her jaw tightened. "Weakness is death. That truth was carved into me long before your species lit its first fire." He leaned against the railing, arms folded. "Maybe. Or maybe it's not weakness they are seeing. Maybe it's change, and change scares them more than fear ever did." The thought lingered in her mind, unwelcome yet difficult to cast aside. She had built herself into a figure of terror, but terror bred stagnation. Now, standing beside someone who refused to cower, she began to wonder if survival demanded something more than obedience wrung out of trembling hearts. The reckoning arrived sooner than expected. A coalition of rival warlords gathered their fleets, emboldened by rumors of her hesitation, and drove them toward her station in a storm of fire. Reports arrived hourly, ships crossing borders, banners raised in defiance. The empire she had shaped through fear was turning upon itself, and the universe watched with bated breath. In the war chamber, her generals waited for orders. Their faces revealed both fear of her and doubt in her resolve. She stood tall at the center, cloak falling like shadow around her, while the human remained at her right, silent but present. The general's eyes flicked to him often, as though his mere existence tilted the balance of power. "They come to strip me of my crown," she said, her voice carrying through the chamber like steel dragged against stone. "They believe I have grown soft. That fear no longer shields me." Her gaze swept across them. "Let them come. We will not cower. We will not yield." The human stepped forward then, his tone calm but steady. "Fear may have built this empire, but fear won't save it now. They expect you to answer with fire and death, the way you always have. Do the unexpected. Show them something they can't imagine, strength without terror." A murmur rippled through the chamber. Some scoffed, others stared, but none dared speak aloud against him while she listened. She turned her head slightly, violet eyes narrowing. "And what would you have me do, human? Embrace mercy and hope my enemies laid down their blades?" "No," he said, "but fight for more than your throne. Fight for the ones who follow you because they believe, not because they are afraid. Give them a reason to stand beside you even when they are no longer afraid of you." The chamber fell silent. His words carried dangerous seed, one that could either take root or destroy them all. She waited, the weight of empires pressing against her shoulders. Then she spoke, her decision ringing out like a blade unsheathed. "Prepare the fleets. We meet them not as tyrants but as defenders. Let them see that strength does not end where fear ends." The battle that followed stretched across the stars, fire blossoming against the void. Enemy warships descended in formation, their banners bright with the promise of rebellion. Yet her fleets did not scatter as her enemies had hoped. They rallied with precision, not only under her command but with a fervor that surprised even their own captains. For the first time, her soldiers saw her not as a monster to obey, but as a leader to follow. She stood at the helm of her flagship, energy radiating from her like the heart of a storm. The human was beside her, voice steady as he offered strategies born of improvisation and instinct. Where she brought overwhelming power, he brought cunning, weaving patterns the enemy could not anticipate. Together they turned the tide, breaking through lines that had seemed impenetrable. But the true climax came when the rival warlords themselves appeared on the battlefield, their flagships surrounding her like vultures circling a wounded beast. Their voices filled the comm channels, mocking, declaring her reign ended. The expectation was clear. She would lash out in fury, unleash devastation, and prove herself once more the monster they had painted her to be. Instead, she spoke with a calm that silenced even her enemies. You believed fear kept me strong. You believed I would crumble when fear faltered. But strength is not fear. Strength is standing when every blade is turned against you and still refusing to bow. Today, you will see not a harbinger of silence but the voice of an empire that will not break. Her fleet surged forward at her command, and in that moment her words became fire in the hearts of those who followed. They fought not because they trembled before her, but because they chose her. The battle became more than survival. It became transformation. When the last enemy vessel burned and the remnants fled into the dark, silence returned to the battlefield. Yet it was not the silence of fear. It was the silence of awe, of realization that something irrevocable had shifted. On the bridge, she stood tall, her eyes still glowing faintly but no longer with the cold burn of isolation. The human, blooded but alive, leaned against a console and met her gaze with the faintest of smiles. You did it without fear, he said softly. Her chest rose and fell, and for the first time she allowed herself a breath that felt unchained. She turned to him, her voice quiet but resonant. Perhaps you were right, human. Perhaps I was never meant to be a weapon. Perhaps I was meant to be more. The officers around them lowered their heads, not because terror demanded it, but because respect compelled it. She looked once more to the stars, where the wreckage of rebellion drifted among the endless dark. Everyone was afraid of me, she murmured, almost to herself. But you were not. And because of that, the galaxy will learn a new kind of strength. The human stood beside her, silent, content to let her words settle into the bones of history. Together they faced the void, no longer ruler and prisoner, but something far more dangerous, allies bound not by fear, but by choice. The victory had not ended the war, it had only redrawn its borders. The rival fleets had been broken, yet fragments of their rebellion slipped away into the void, gathering strength in shadows where her reach had grown thinner. In the weeks that followed, the fortress station hummed with both triumph and unease. The empire was alive, but it was no longer the same. Its ruler had spoken not in the language of terror, but in the cadence of resolve, and that subtle shift spread faster than any proclamation. She felt it in the way her officers addressed her now, their voices less brittle, their gazes steadier. Respect had begun to displace fear. To many, this was proof of her evolution. To others, it was an omen of collapse. Empires carved by fear did not soften without consequence. The human walked those halls with her, no longer shadowed by gods, yet always shadowed by eyes. Some saw him as the spark of renewal, others as the wedge that would break her throne. He bore the scrutiny with the same calm he had shown on the day of their first meeting, answering suspicion with quiet humor, offering no apologies for his presence. One evening, she confronted him about it. They stood in the command chamber, the stars spilling like molten glass beyond the viewport. You have become a symbol, she said, her voice low. To my enemies, proof that I can be swayed. To my followers, proof that I can change. Symbols are dangerous, human. They burn brighter than truth, and faster too. He studied her, then leaned against the console as if unbothered by the weight of entire empires pressing down on them both. Symbols only matter because people give them meaning. You can't control what they see. You can only decide what you'll stand for when they look. His words unsettled her not because they challenged her, but because they echoed the questions already clawing at the back of her mind. What did she stand for, now that fear no longer defined her? For years, she had been the harbinger of silence, her name a blade pressed against the throat of the galaxy. Now, silence itself felt like an enemy. The answer would not wait for her to shape it. Reports soon arrived of uprisings on border worlds, not led by warlords but by civilians who believed the time had come to cast off all rule, hers included. Without fear, they whispered, she was nothing. And without her, they might build something new. She convened her council, the room tense with clashing opinions. Some urged immediate annihilation, burn the worlds until obedience returned. Others advised diplomacy, a word that had never held weight in her reign. At the far side of the table, the human listened quietly until the voices subsided, then spoke in the silence they left behind. If you crush them, you prove your enemies right, that you've only replaced fear with fire. If you ignore them, you look weak. But if you face them and give them a reason to choose you, you prove there's a future in following you. The council bristled at his intrusion, but she silenced them with a single glance. Her eyes lingered on him, searching for the flaw in his logic, but finding instead the same calm conviction that had withstood her power. At last, she nodded. Then we go to them. Not as conquerors, as rulers who will be seen. The journey to the border world was swift, yet each hour pressed against her like a test she had not prepared for. Fear had been her language. She spoke it fluently, instinctively. To stand without it felt like stripping away armor she had worn all her life. The human remained at her side, offering no false assurances, only presence. It was enough. When they landed, the city greeted them not with bows but with defiance. Crowds gathered in the square, voices raised, banners painted with demands for freedom. Soldiers stood ready, hands on their weapons, waiting for the order that would unleash bloodshed. For a moment, the old reflex surged within her, one gesture, and fear would return, sharp and absolute. Instead, she stepped forward alone, her cloak trailing over the cracked stone of the plaza. The crowd's anger pressed against her like a storm, yet she stood firm. Her voice carried, not amplified by power, but sharpened by intent. You think me a tyrant. You think me strong only because you trembled. But hear me now, strength is not fear. Strength is standing when the void itself demands you fall. I will not destroy you, because I will not prove you right. But neither will I abandon you, because you are mine, and I will not leave what is mine to break. The words rippled through the crowd, not silencing them, but reshaping the fury into something sharper, more uncertain. Murmurs rose. Some spat, others lowered their banners. She felt the shift, not surrender, not yet, but recognition. The human watched from the edge of the platform, eyes fixed on her. When she stepped back, he joined her, his voice pitched low enough only for her to hear. That was more dangerous than any battle. But it worked. Did it? She asked, her expression unreadable. For today, he said. And sometimes one day is enough. That night, in the quiet of her quarters, she allowed herself to feel the weight of it all. The empire she had built was no longer what it had been, and the path ahead was shrouded in uncertainty. Yet beside the uncertainty stood a man who had never bowed, who had risked his life not for power but for her. That, more than any fleet, steadied her. She closed her eyes, hearing again the words she had once asked him in her throne hall. Why aren't you afraid of me? Now, the question no longer carried the same edge. Now, it carried something else. Something like hope, though she still hesitated to name it. Beyond the station walls, the galaxy churned with whispers of rebellion and rebirth. Her enemies plotted, her allies wavered, and her empire stood at the precipice of transformation. But for the first time, she did not feel alone at its center. She looked toward the human, who met her gaze without hesitation. The silence between them was not heavy now, but alive with the unspoken truth that the battles ahead would test them both in ways neither fear nor strength alone could withstand. And for the first time in her long reign, she welcomed the challenge. The stars above the border world faded into dawn, and with the pale light came word that her gesture had not gone unnoticed. Across the empire, worlds long silent in fear were speaking, some with cautious loyalty, others with emboldened dissent. Her refusal to answer defiance with destruction had shaken the galaxy more profoundly than any campaign of annihilation. For the first time, her enemies sensed she could be resisted without obliteration, while her allies questioned if mercy signaled strength or the beginning of decline. The alien woman, once the harbinger of silence, stood at the edge of her command deck, staring out at the swirl of nebulae beyond. Her features remained as sharp and imposing as ever, yet her eyes carried the shadow of unease. Every decision now seemed heavier, for it was not only fleets and territories that hung in the balance, it was the essence of who she would become. The human stood nearby, his presence as steady as the hum of the engines beneath their feet. He had no command to give, no crown to wear, yet his voice carried into her thoughts even in silence. When she turned to him, He did not speak immediately. He only watched, waiting for her to ask what she had already asked countless times in the chambers of her mind. "Did I err?" she asked at last, her voice low, stripped of a commanding resonance that once shattered rooms. He considered before answering. A habit she had learned was not hesitation but care. "You changed the rules," he said. "And everyone is scrambling to decide what that means. Some will call it weakness. Some will call it wisdom. The truth is, it's both. You made them see you differently, and now you'll have to live with what they see." His words carried no judgment, but they pressed on her all the same. For years she had wielded terror with flawless precision. Now she was wielding uncertainty, and uncertainty was a weapon that cut both ways. News arrived soon after. A coalition of her fiercest rivals, long fractured, was gathering under a banner forged from her own shift. They called themselves the Dawn Accord, a movement of worlds and warlords who believed her new restraint was the Empire's first fracture, and they meant to drive the blade deeper. Their fleets massed at the rim, vowing to free entire systems from her rule. The Council clamored for decisive action. Some urged her to strike swiftly, to erase the Dawn Accord before it grew. Others whispered that the galaxy's gaze had changed, and that destruction would undo what she had just begun to build. In the noise of their arguments, she turned once more to the human. He alone did not argue, and for that, she pressed him. "What would you do?" she asked, the question more dangerous than any order she had ever given. He met her gaze, unflinching. "You can't go back to who you were. Fear won't hold them the way it used to. But if you don't fight, you'll lose everything. So you fight differently. You show them not just that you can destroy, but that you can endure. Make the Accord chase you, bleed themselves trying, until their followers see they've chosen a dream that starves them. Show the galaxy that standing against you isn't freedom, it's ruin." His strategy was not mercy, nor was it terror. It was something sharper, subtler, and it rang true in her bones. She gave the order, and the fleets began to move. The campaign that followed was unlike any she had ever commanded. No worlds were glassed into silence, no cities burned into ash. Instead, she struck with precision, unraveling the Accord's supply lines, turning allies against each other with careful feints, forcing them to fracture under their own weight. Each victory was measured not in body counts but in survival, in the stubborn endurance of her empire against a tide meant to drown it. Through it all, the human stood beside her, not as a general, not as an advisor whose words could be written into doctrine, but as the one presence that reminded her why she had chosen this path at all. At times she resented him, for it was easier to be feared than to be understood. But in the quiet between battles, when exhaustion pressed against her bones, she found herself drawing strength not from fear of losing, but from the knowledge that someone believed she was worth standing beside. The Accord faltered at last, its fleet splintering after a disastrous siege in which they lost more to their own hunger and infighting than to her fire. When the remnants scattered into the stars, her council rejoiced, calling it proof that mercy could win where terror failed. Yet she knew better. It was not mercy that had won, it was will, sharpened by patience, strengthened by something she had once scorned as weakness. As the Empire celebrated, she returned to her chamber, where the human waited. She studied him for a long moment, her voice quiet when it came. "Once, I asked you why you weren't afraid of me. I think I finally understand. You never saw me as the sum of my power. You saw me as what I could be, even when I couldn't." He smiled faintly, a rare softness in the face of a man who had stood unflinching against her might. "Fear blinds people. It made them see you as a monster. But I never looked away." Her gaze lingered on him, and for the first time since she had taken her throne, she allowed herself to imagine what it meant not only to be followed, but to be chosen. The thought was terrifying in its own way, but it was a terror she no longer wished to silence. Beyond the viewport, the stars stretched endlessly, a canvas of war and wonder yet to come. The Dawn Accord was broken, but new threats would rise, as they always did. Her empire was no longer the same, and neither was she. The galaxy would test her again, perhaps harder than before. But as she stood there, the weight of silence no longer pressing her down, she realized the conflict had never been only about fleets and worlds. It had always been about her, and about the one human who had taught her that fear was not the only way to be seen. And with that realization, The galaxy's endless expanse no longer felt like a burden, but an invitation.